Sometimes it feels as though the creative industries take place in a different universe to most other careers. Whilst it sounds like a wonderful thing to create art for a living, there are countless stories of difficulties and doubt from video game developers. Very few games have totally smooth development periods, and there are plenty of tales to pick from where devs were faced with truly unthinkable choices. I'm Si for WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 insane video game risks that totally paid off. Number 10. Halo's multiplayer is scrapped 4 months before release. The history of Halo Combat Evolved is one with a series of pretty hard shifts along the way. The game started life as an RTS title developed for Apple computers and somehow ended up as a tentpole first-person shooter for Microsoft's Xbox. Not only was producing a first-person shooter for a console in this time period a risk when the formula was still being worked out, but doing so for an untested machine was incredibly daring. What's funny about Halo is that originally it was conceived with a multiplayer focus and the story came later. However, it almost released without it. Just 4 months before the game's launch, the current multiplayer was deemed not good enough. So with the real possibility of running out of time and shipping without a dedicated multiplayer mode, what the team had made was crumpled up and thrown to the devs from Bungie West who had just finished work on Oni. Bungie later called the multiplayer shoehorned in later interviews due to this, but it really spoke to the power of Halo's engine and the hard work put in thereafter that it turned out as good as it did. Number 9. Trey Parker walks out of hospital for South Park: The Fractured But Whole. Creating South Park must be a taxing affair despite its disarmingly simple look. In fact, because it's visually a straightforward program, it actually means that creators Matt Stone and Trey Parker can risk putting episodes together at the 11th hour basically every week. In this way, South Park is able to adapt and react to breaking news and trends in ways that most shows cannot. 2014 saw the release of the RPG South Park: The Stick of Truth. The creative duo were rather detached from its development, however, and wanted to be more in tune with the creation of its 2017 sequel, The Fractured But Whole. However, Trey Parker had to deal with a different kind of stress due to an emergency gallbladder removal, and so getting his voice parts done for the game was a tricky situation. As South Park art director and voice actor Adrian Beard recalls, there was even a day where Parker convinced his doctor to let him leave the hospital, go to the office to record some voiceover, and then come back to the ward immediately after, just because he wanted the game to be sweet. Proving ultimately that Trey Parker can't help but live life inside of a creative whirlwind. Number 8. Resident Evil saves Capcom after being told to cancel it. Capcom may be one of the most beloved and respected video game developers in the world. Their back catalogue is long and varied thanks to taking chances. In 1993, in order to diversify their portfolio, young developer Shinji Mikami was made lead on a new horror project despite his hatred for being spooked. The idea, of course, was that he would use his fearfulness to craft something fresh and effective. But during the early 90s, the studio was facing near extinction. Despite some huge successes, the sales of constant Street Fighter II revisions and Mega Man sequels were dwindling. According to Itchy Tasty, an unofficial history of Resident Evil by Alex O'Neill, Capcom hired an American financial consultant to evaluate their business. The fledgling Biohazard, helmed by an untested progeny, was 3 years into production, and the consultant suggested cancelling it and hedging on a safer bet. Tokuro Fujiwara, the game's producer, insisted that Capcom see development through. Resident Evil absolutely devoured the company's sales expectations upon release and saved them from financial disaster. Capcom estimates that the Resi franchise has moved over 124 million units worldwide to date, in part thanks to Fujiwara's belief in the game. Number 7. The Wind Waker's graphics are kept a secret. In 2000, Nintendo showed a tech demo for their brand new system, the Nintendo GameCube, that saw Link and Ganon face off in a graphical engine not unlike what had come before in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Eiji Aonuma, director of the next game in the series, felt that this was old hat by this stage. He was not enthused by the demo and was instead inspired by an artist's sketch of a cartoony, oddly proportioned Link with giant eyes. He knew that this was the direction he wanted to go, but he also knew that Shigeru Miyamoto and company would hate it, so held off on showing the game to his colleagues for as long as possible. Miyamoto was said to have literally cringed at first sight of Wind Waker, and through production reminded Aonuma that it wasn't too late to change course. More than just his own distaste for it, Miyamoto likely knew that it was a risk. Yes, Zelda had only been 3D for a few years by this point, but 1998 Ocarina of Time had been massive. Such a departure would surely upset the apple cart. Of course, famously, it did. Both fans and Miyamoto eventually came round to Wind Waker, and it set the precedent that Zelda could be a series that breaks new ground stylistically with every major release. Number 6, God of War 2018 forges on despite bosses' disapproval. When rebooting the God of War franchise, Santa Monica Studios had a hard road ahead of them. Director Cory Barlog gave a keynote speech at DevCon in 2018 about God of War's complex behind-the-scenes story, and it was one filled with doubt. Because the game was a complete refresh for the series, with the engine and art and so on being worked on in tandem, producing a good demo for playtesters was nigh on impossible. Many who did play it were furious thanks to the changes to the gameplay and the leading man, Kratos. The most worrying moment came just 6 months from launch. President of Sony Interactive Entertainment Worldwide Studio, Shuhei Yoshida, visited the studio to get hands-on with the game. According to Barlog, it was a buggy mess, and Yoshida played it whilst shaking his head in silence. He didn't say a word to Barlog, but the director heard from a colleague that bumped into Yoshida later that what he played had horrified him. Some people would see the lack of a verbal reaction as a big red stop sign. The word horrified would certainly put some developers into a tailspin. It was make or break time. Did God of War slow its roll and perhaps consider a different direction? No, instead Barlog and team put their noses to the grindstone, and in so doing released a title that rightfully won several end-of-year awards.
Alright there, geezer, it's Jules here from FGS, also known as the Future Game Show, and I've got a special announcement for you because you see, tomorrow on June the 10th at 6 PM BST, the Future Game Show is going live with their June event. There's going to be world premieres for trailers of video games that you've never seen before, there's going to be a VR showcase, and it's going to be hosted by none other than Yuri Lowenthal and Laura Bailey. You know, the voices behind Marvel's Spider-Man? How's that not going to be fun? But that's not all, because I will actually be live reacting to the event over on TikTok. I'll be streaming over there with my pal Josh, so why not consider going and following us over there on FGS on TikTok, and while you're there, you might as well go over to the YouTube channel as well, where it's FGS, and you can see all of my gaming content that I put out every single week. Hope to see you over there. Let's have a laugh. Peace.
Number 5, Cuphead developers remortgage their homes. Video games aren't just made by huge studios with dump trucks full of money, sometimes they come from the minds of passionate programmers in their bedrooms, using their free time to bring their dream game to life. Cuphead's development began around 2013 as a dream in the minds of brothers Jared and Chad Moldenhauer. A short clip of the idea of a run-and-gunner inspired by 1930s cartoons was posted on YouTube, which grabbed the attention of Microsoft. After striking a deal, the ball was really rolling, and industry interest grew because of just how unique and stunning the art style was. As the game's demands grew, so did the need for more staff and more investment. As such, the brothers decided to quit their day jobs, which yes, they still had even after signing a release deal with Microsoft, and even remortgaged their homes in order to spend on supporting their fledgling studio MDHR. In the economy of today, even owning a mortgage is a dream for some people. Cuphead's devs gambled it all by selling their houses back to the bank in order to bring their game to life. It gives the final boss of the game's gambling aesthetic a deeper meaning indeed. Number 4, Sega gives away their system seller. The Mega Drive got the head start on Nintendo's own 16-bit machine, and it was an impressive little bit of kit, but it lacked a true eye-catching must-have game changer. Thus, Sega went about creating a mascot. Thankfully for them, it worked, as Sonic the Hedgehog proved to be extremely popular with those who got to play the game before its release in July 1991. However, Sega of America made the pretty incredible decision a few months later to start including the game free with the console. Previous Genesis systems had come with Altered Beast, a fine game, but not one on Sonic's level. On the one hand, there was hesitance that they would lose money from consumers who would normally buy the console and the game. However, this proved to be fruitful as it instantly attracted more people who needed that extra bit of incentive. In fact, to keep everyone happy, those who had bought a Mega Drive before Sonic's release could apply for a free copy of Sonic the Hedgehog, which only helped to make sure that the blue blur was the only character anyone was talking about in 1991. The long-lasting positive impact of such a decision was that more people were ready and prepared to make 1992's Sonic the Hedgehog 2 the most successful video game launch at that time in history. Number 3, Modern Warfare's best level is crafted independently by a medical student. Applying for a job in the arts is always a risk in itself, so props must go to Mohamed Alavi. Putting aside his promising medical career, he went to university to study game design. Most games, especially AAA titles like Call of Duty, are crafted by teams of hundreds these days. This wasn't so much the case in the early 2000s. When Alavi joined Infinity Ward, he was one of 30 who applied themselves to whatever needed doing to realise the overall vision. As such, an idea Alavi had for a stealth-based level presented him with a choice. Either he went to busy programmers with the concept who may not have the time for it, or he learned to do it himself. Alavi himself described his code as a mess compared to the pros, but the important thing is that it functioned how it was supposed to when his team gathered round to see it. That stage was all gillied up, the highly memorable moment of Modern Warfare's campaign where things slowed down for just a moment. Instead of being an all-out shooting gallery, the mission is all about precision, careful planning, and vulnerability. Oh, and just to prove he wasn't a fluke, Alavi also went on to craft Modern Warfare 2's No Russian, one of the franchise's most impactful cinematic moments. Number 2, Final Fantasy XIV turned spectacle into spectacular. At the end of 2012, the long-storied Final Fantasy series hit its lowest ever point. After the much-derided trilogy of FF13 games, Final Fantasy's next entry in the franchise needed to sing, and instead it croaked. Final Fantasy XIV was meant to be the evolution of the series' previous MMO efforts, but it was anything but. Even aside from major performance issues, it just wasn't fun. It was bogged down in convoluted systems and menus, and its core loop seemed to be made up mostly of tireless grinding. Developers Square were presented with several unenviable options on what to do next. After a year of the game being a laughingstock and a disappointment for invested fans, Square announced that they were pulling the plug and starting over. For a name like Final Fantasy, at this point an institution in gaming, it was a bold move. Getting it right was so important that it delayed various other projects at Square Enix's headquarters. With a new director and producer in Yoshi P, who had not worked on the original FF14 nor even met most of the existing staff, the next 2 years were an exhaustive challenge. Thankfully, they paid off. Final Fantasy XIV rubber-banded from being an embarrassing disaster to being an immediately impressive title that went on to critical acclaim, industry awards, and became one of the front-running MMOs of the modern era. And number 1, Broken Age starts the era of crowdfunding. Video games are a business. Your game can be as crazy as you dream it, but it needs to sell, and thus investors are likely to select safe bets. This leaves small teams and untested ideas out in the cold without the monetary support they need to get off the ground. Enter crowdfunding. Double Fine were a respected group amongst their fans, but hardly a mainstream studio. Figurehead Tim Schafer was known for his love of classic adventure games, but his attempts to make them had been repeatedly rebuffed by investors. And so he decided to use Kickstarter to make his dream game happen. Broken Age was really the first big crowdfunding success story in gaming. It smashed its goal of $400,000, coming in at $3 million when the campaign ended. The game released to positive reviews, but more than this, showed many other studios that this was a possible route if you had something that caught enough attention. Broken Age really opened the floodgates for games like Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, Yooka-Laylee, Shovel Knight, just to name a few, to even exist. Every one of these projects is a risk, as those who support your game have certain expectations, at the very least a finished product at some point, and the whole process is fraught with possible issues. Still, when it works, it really shows that the gaming industry is not beholden exclusively to giant corporations. Whilst these video games thankfully all panned out, there are of course some that go horribly wrong. Recently I ran down the biggest Xbox risks that backfired. You can check that out right now. Leave a comment down below on your favourite developmental risk stories. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Head over to WhatCulture.com for more content every day. You can follow me on Twitter at Syniac_123. I've been Cy for WhatCulture, and have a good week.